this could be a really bad ramble. We'll see what happens. Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Welcome to the channel if you've not seen me before. This is a spin-off video from my announcement video about Garbaugust. Garbaugust hasn't happened yet, it's not started yet. This is all about, in August, we can be reading trashy books. And there's several different definitions of a trashy book. And we're taking it off Ollie from Criminoli's definition of what is trashy. And it's not a bad book necessarily, it's just books that have been pretty much released and published for cynical reasons in general. So it could be that it's written by a celebrity, it could be that it's one of a series of loads and loads of books of a similar type, it could be like cheesy lowest common denominator kind of plots like killer animals or exploitative plots or random scenes of sex and violence that are there to kind of entice the reader more, that kind of thing. But doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad book. Some of those books can be good. Some of those books can be your favourite books. So it's not necessarily a damnation, but it's a celebration of trash, because if you do find those little nuggets, then that's a really cool thing. So all month we're reading that, and a big part of that is the Paperbacks from Hell. So the Paperbacks from Hell is a nickname that Grady Hendrix gave to vintage horror from the 80s and early 90s. I think 70s, about 70s, 80s and 90s. Then he produced this book that talked about the Paperbacks from Hell and celebrated that period of horror novels. And it is a very quite unique time in some ways. And when you see people writing stuff that harks back to that time, it is that sort of almost like a no rules thing. And it's a mixture of one, no rules, and two, horror fiction developed to a point where it's quite graphic, and it can be that visceral, in your face shock value that you don't necessarily get in the old sort of ghost stories of the 1920s, you know. So I think that's that beautiful point of shock and a lack of rules, which makes that vintage horror thing quite a thing. So anyway, that's one of the prompts for Garbaugust. So there's several prompts. And if you haven't seen the Garbaugust introduction videos, I've thoroughly recommend it. And people have been doing some really elaborate introductions, which is great. I've done a little bit of more of an elaborate one for me, which is nowhere near as good as a lot of them, where I was outside by my bin. But yeah, watch the Garbaugust introductions if you haven't seen this, but you haven't seen them. But yeah, vintage horror is a big part of it, these Paperbacks from Hell. So I wanted to talk about horror. I wanted to use this opportunity to talk about what I was going to read for those prompts in Garbaugust, and then just talk about horror in general, because I haven't really done that. I've talked a little bit about Stephen King. So I've done a top 10 books of Stephen King about 2 years ago, and he comes up now and again in my book hauls or in my monthly roundups or my individual book reviews. So I did one recently for one of his books. I can't remember which one it was. Cujo, maybe. I think I did a review of Cujo, which was really good. And I've been reading Stephen King all of my life, pretty much. So I will talk about Stephen King in a minute, but I do want to talk about horror in general, and I'm going to talk about what I'm going to read for Garbaugust, what I like about horror, and then what I'm hoping to read in general, maybe before Halloween, some of it before Halloween, and certainly, hopefully, before the end of the year, if I can. So I've got several things I want to read. But let's just start with what I'm going to read in Garbaugust, August, and then we'll go from there. So last year, I read The Rats by James Herbert, which is a very famous, classic, and massively influential vintage horror story from the 70s and from that period that's been celebrated in the Paperbacks from Hell book. And this is another book from James Herbert called Moon. I don't know a lot about it. I read the back, and it's about, it seems to be a monster that's stalking someone's mind from what it says in the back. And it's probably a little more than that. It's slightly bigger than The Rats, but James Herbert's like one of the most, if not the most famous British horror writer. And you know, if you find the right second-hand shop, there's like racks and racks of James Herbert stuff. And you know, if you're into his stuff, then you can usually find them eventually. Dinar Kuntz is another one, but I think James Herbert is more celebrated. So Moon, that's one. There's another one that I associate with Garbaugust because when we talk about Garbaugust amongst our co-hosts on Voxer and just in general, you'll see it mentioned in the videos. Virginia Andrews is mentioned a lot. And my sister was obsessed by two authors, Virginia Andrews and John Saul. So I kind of associate John Saul with that kind of thing. So I'm sticking him in Garbaugust because of that. I did get the approval of Ollie when I mentioned that I was going to get a John Saul book, or at least I associated him with Garbaugust. I don't know anything about this, When the Wind Blows, but I know he's into that sort of supernatural thing. So it's probably possession or a ghost or something like that. So anyway, John Saul, When the Wind Blows. If you've read that, let me know what you think. But I associated him with that sort of trashy, not horror thing as well. But you know, that could be unfair. And again, this doesn't mean they're bad books. It just means that they're part of that exploitative horror thing. So John Saul, shout out to my sister. This is mentioned in the Paperbacks from Hell book, and it's been reissued, I think, with the Paperbacks from Hell logo, because they've reissued a bunch of them to kind of exploit the initial book that came out. So this is Adventureland by Steve Harris. And Adventureland, that's like a ghost train. And this is like a fun fair setting for a horror story. Fun fair setting for horror stories are awesome. I love that. So I always think it's a fantastic setting for horror stories. And, you know, you get that in all sorts of different media. You know, the fun fair is a sinister place in some ways. It's that extra heightened heartbeat thing probably that's going on, that extra adrenaline you get from the rides, the thrill of your life kind of blurbs around the rides, you know, and you know, it's a great setting to put some kind of serial killer in there, or some sort of ghostly goings on, or some supernatural element to it. Maybe one of the rides is possessed, you know, that kind of thing. So there's lots you can do with it. And Steve Harris apparently has made this very well-known book from the Paperbacks from Hell series. So this is one I'm going to read. It's quite big, actually. So this will take me a little while. But that's one I'm keen to read for Garbaugust. So have you read Adventureland by Steve Harris? Let me know. I doubt if it's the Steve Harris from Iron Maiden. But who knows? And then Richard Lehman gets mentioned a lot. And I read some Richard Lehman last year. And it's very overly sexualized, it's got to be said. He seems to like torturing women. But this is the Travelling Vampire Show. So again, it looks like some sort of sideshow carnival kind of situation, and with vampires in it. So have you read Richard Lehman's The Travelling Vampire Show? This is what I'm hoping to read for Garbaugust as well. So I'm hoping to fit these in. And what I'm planning to do is use up those anything goes bits of the month. So there's 4 prompts, and then there's like an anything goes moment. So we'll see how we get on, see how much I can read. But those last two, Steve Harris's Adventureland and this one, are the 2 I'm most keen to read for Garbaugust. So those 4 books are literally what I've planned for those prompts. So there's also, I did mention this before. I mentioned this during the Horror Mayhem in May, that I discovered this local author. He's a lovely guy. We were chatting away when we were both trying to sell our books on a local bookstall. There's lots of authors in Portsmouth. It's cool. So I've written books, and I was selling my books, and he was selling his books. And I bought this one, and this is body horror. And it definitely fits the Garbaugust thing, because I've read the first story, and it is quite grotesque. It's quite gross, and you can see that he's influenced by the trashiest kind of horror, really. So yeah, I definitely think this fits. So I will hopefully read some more of this book as well, fleshed out by Rob Litsky. Yeah, I found the first story quite entertaining. It was quite unusual as well. It was quite it was this sort of visceral, violent, gut-wrenching, physical horror that was based around some sort of hair fetish. yeah. So, Fleshed Out by Rob Lietsky. I'll hopefully read some more of that. So, just before I get onto these bits, just wanted to say something about the fact that I have been reading horror since I was a young teenager. So, as I said, my sister was well into John Saul and Virginia Andrews, and I read the first Stephen King book I read was Night Shift, which I borrowed from her when I was like 12 or 13 or something, and then I read The Howling by Gary Brandner. She had that as well, and I really enjoyed that as well. And then I felt like I was reading stuff that wasn't designed for a young teenager as well, so I felt a little bit naughty reading The Howling as well. But I read that, and there's things like the sort of sci-fi horror crossover as well. Like I read H.G. Wells' Invisible Man around that time as well. But yeah, Stephen King was a big name for me when I was a kid, and I just want to throw this one out here because it's such a great book. Pet Sematary is one of his celebrated books, and it's a fantastic book. And I think it's a great example of what horror can do, in the sense that horror uses the supernatural or the grotesque or the horrifying to basically explore human nature and human behavior and human relationships. And this is Stephen King really trying to get to grips with grief. So a lot of this is based around the getting over the death of a family member. I won't say too much, I don't want to spoil it. But it is a really interesting meditation on grief, if you like, but with these horrifying moments in it. Some of it's pretty creepy. Some people really, really get affected by this book. Yeah, Stephen King does that. He writes great characters, and because he writes great characters, it really has an effect. And horror uses those horror tropes to explore what people are like. I'll just throw up a Stephen King book I haven't read. So I've read about 25 of his books, but I've still got loads I haven't read. And this is one I haven't read that gets recommended a lot. A lot of people like this one. This is written when he was Richard Backman, and this is a dystopian book. It's a really dinny format. I don't get why it comes in this format, but there we are. I can't do a lot about that. I do want to read this. I don't think I'll read this for Garbaugust, but I'm just saying there's a bunch of other Stephen King I haven't read yet, and that's one of them. But he's an awesome author, I think, and I just saw Criminoli talking about, he just read Billy Summers, and he was just talking about it, saying how much he liked it, which is really cool. And he says it's got a sort of like a romantic edge to it, like a relationship between the main character and a woman that he meets. And Stephen King's really good at that. I think he's probably better at writing positive characters and positive situations than the grotesque stuff, which is kind of weird. Yeah, some of my favourite moments in Stephen King books are those intimate things, like in 11/22/63, there's a massive love story that's really, really cool. And that's one of the reasons why I like Joyland so much, because of the romantic element to it. So, yeah, Stephen King can write, and he's obviously famous for his horror stuff the most, but he does write other stuff as well. So, just want to mention my first foray into horror, if you like, and it was at school, and this is something that really is genuinely horrific, but I don't think it gets associated with horror much. And I read this in my English class. We studied it, and it blew me away. I loved it to death. I've mentioned it on my channel before, but The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, I think is such a vivid, powerful, and compelling story, and it's just so, it just goes crazy when the seas just erupt with this horrific stuff to punish the mariner for killing the albatross, and it's just brilliantly done, and I just think it's really it's just really vivid. It's really ghastly, if you like, if that's the right word for it. So yeah, Rime of the Ancient Mariner was my first discovery of that side of literature. So clearly, this is an old story. It's an old poem. It's a poem with this fantastic imagery in it, and this sort of horrific things that happen to the mariner on the boat. So the other thing I wanted to mention was that another thing that hit me when I was younger, which definitely has forays into horror, is the Twilight Zone. Another thing I've mentioned a lot on my channel. I can't tell you how much I love the Twilight Zone. It's one of my biggest cultural influences, if that's the right word. One of my biggest cultural loves. I love the Twilight Zone so much. We named our band after it. I've mentioned it a number of times on the channel. But several of the stories were written by Charles Beaumont. And Charles Beaumont's got quite a interesting kind of macabre look on life. And if you ever get a chance to read his stories, they're really good. And he wrote some of the most creepy and atmospheric stories in the Twilight Zone. So Perchance to Dream is a really interesting selection of his stories. Charles Beaumont, very interesting man. So that's me trying to kind of stress the importance of horror in my initial reading. So there's a bunch of stuff that I need to read. So I really liked Heart-Shaped Box by Joe Hill, and this is Nosferatu, another big tome. But this is Stephen King's son, Joe Hill, and I really think he writes really well. From what I've read one of his graphic novels, and I've read Heart-Shaped Box, and I'm really looking forward to reading this. So I'll be reading this at some point. I don't think I'll be reading it for Garbaugust, and I don't think you can say it's Garbaugust, but I want to read it before Halloween, because it'd be nice if I can recommend some new books before Halloween. This is definitely one on my radar. And again, I know I'm going to read this one soon, with David Cronenberg's Consumed. I'm a huge David Cronenberg fan. I love especially his early films, so his first sort of 5 or 6 films. I think The Fly is a masterpiece. I think Videodrome is a masterpiece. I actually really like Dead Ringers. Doesn't get talked about a lot. I think Dead Ringers is really good. And I quite like Existence as well. The Dead Zone is brilliant. I mean, there's just so many great and Scanners, Rabid, amazing. So yeah, I'm a huge David Cronenberg fan, and this is intriguing. So I will be reading this at some point soon as well. I don't think I'll be reading it for Garbaugust, although don't know, it could fit. You tell me if it fits. Again, Kim Newman is a very celebrated writer. This was well cheap when I found it. Look at that. But Anno Dracula is like him using the Dracula story and kind of revisiting it in a different kind of fresh kind of way. And he's written several books in this series actually. And when I read this, because I've read other things by Kim Newman, but this will be the first proper fiction I've read by him if I read this. So if you read the Anno Dracula books, let me know what you think of those. But that's something else I want to read. And The Troop by Nick Cutter is a book that I've heard a lot about, and it's been raved about by lots of booktubers. I think I first heard about it from Rachel from Shades of Orange, who is a bit of an expert on horror books. And if you're interested in more stuff about horror, definitely check out her channel. So I've definitely heard her talk about this book, but I've heard several people talk about The Troop by Nick Cutter. So this is another one I want to read. Again, hopefully before Halloween. And another book I want to talk about is Let the Right One In. So this is a fantastic film. I think it's Swedish, the film. And it's based on this book. And the book is supposed to be better, Let the Right One In. It's about a girl, a very young girl who's a vampire. It's a really creepy, atmospheric film. And her relationship with this boy that she meets. And it's just so unique. It's a fantastic film. I can't wait to read this. So I do want to read this. And I'm really glad I've got it now. But again, I want to read this before October if I can, before I can't recommend it anymore for Halloween. So some point before the middle of October at least. And then this is one that this is a bit of sci-fi horror, but again, I've had it a while. I'm very excited to read it. Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes, and that combination of science fiction and horror works really well, I think. And I think this is apparently very claustrophobic and tense and thrilling, and you can't put it down. That's what I've heard about it. So, as I said earlier, sometimes horror explores humanity and how humans behave when they're desperate, and sometimes it's just a thrill ride. So, we'll see. I can't wait to read that. So, there we go. A bunch of books that I want to read. some of the books that I'm intending to read for Garbaugust, and my general thoughts about horror, and some bits about me starting with horror when I was younger. So there we go. Please comment below on the stuff I've just said, and we'll have a little chat. But in the meantime, Paperbacks from Hell, Garbaugust, let's go.
Paint me a picture